coverage of today's proceedings with NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams, Human Rights Campaign President Chad Griffin, who led the opposition to Prop 8 in California.
And we have gone from the district court in Northern California over these 4 years all the way here to Washington today before the United States Supreme Court. And we are all cautiously optimistic as we wait and see what this court will do.
Also joining us, Austin Nimitz, co-counsel for the legal team defending the ban against same-sex marriage, and Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa on the shift in public opinion on same-sex marriage in California. Good day. I'm Chris Saliza, live in Washington. Andrea is traveling with Secretary Kerry today. Well, Prop 8 is having its day in court, with advocates of both sides of the same-sex marriage debate facing tough questions from the justices. NBC's Justice correspondent Pete Williams joins us from in front of the court. Pete, I can't think of anyone I'd rather hear from here. I know you were in the room talking about this, listening to the arguments, analyzing the arguments. Tell us what we need to know out of what you heard today.
Right. You know, there was a lot of talk before this case about whether this would be the Roe v. Wade of gay rights, with all the positives and negatives of that. And it's quite clear now that it's not going to be, that the Supreme Court, there's very little interest among any of the justices for the kind of sweeping ruling that the two couples who brought this case were asking for, to declare marriage such a fundamental right that no state could deny it. So the court's not going to go there. Now, the fallback position was articulated by the Obama Justice Department. They said, okay, maybe not nationwide, but any state that grants all the privileges of marriage, domestic partnerships, civil unions, but denies same-sex couples the privilege of calling it marriage, restricted to those 9 or so states, including California, and say that's unconstitutional. That got a raspberry from the Supreme Court today. Nobody seemed very interested in that, because many of the justices who would ordinarily be sympathetic to that argument said you're in essence punishing the states that are willing to give same-sex additional rights. So you're now back to the question of whether the court can somehow confine this decision solely to California, and that's where I think it's going to happen. Let's hear a little bit of audio today that the court has just released of Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was perhaps the swing vote here, with his skepticism on what the two couples were asking for.
The problem with the case is that you're really asking, particularly because of the sociological evidence you cite, for us to go into uncharted waters, and you can play with that metaphor. There's a wonderful destination, or there's a cliff, whatever the metaphor is. But you're doing so in a case where the opinion is very narrow. Basically, that once the state goes halfway, it has to go all the way, or 70% of the way. And you're doing so in a case where there's a substantial question on standing. I just wonder if the case was properly granted.
Now, standing, of course, means the question, the legal question of whether the proponents of Prop 8 have the right to be here to represent the state of California. That's a whole separate question. But it does seem likely that the Supreme Court will either say, you know what, we never should have taken this case in the first place. Let's erase the appeals court ruling. We'll let the district court ruling standing. Marriage can resume in California. Or the court will find some way to say the Prop 8 proponents never had a right to be here. The result would be the same. I think it's fair to say that marriage is going to resume in California because Prop 8 will somehow be struck down, but the exact mechanism for that is not at all clear. And in any event, Chris, it seems quite likely it's not going to be any kind of sweeping ruling about same-sex marriage. It may end up not being about gay rights at all.
And Pete, I find the oral arguments here, and we're getting this stuff coming to us moment by moment. We have a little bit of Chief Justice John Roberts talking about the labeling of marriage. Let's play that, and we'll come back and talk about it.
If you tell a child that somebody has to be their friend, I suppose you can force the child to say, this is my friend, but it changes the definition of what it means to be a friend. And that's, it seems to me, what the supporters of Proposition 8 are saying here. All you're interested in is the label, and you insist on changing the definition of the label.
So, Pete, I want to... Sure, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, that gets to the point here about what's at stake in California. If you give all the same legal privileges to same-sex couples as traditional couples have, everything but the privilege of using the word marriage, what is the case all about? to the proponents, it's everything. It's the legitimacy. It's the ability of their children to say, our parents are married. It's the standing in the community. But as you hear Justice Roberts ask the question, it's like, well, there really isn't that much difference.
NBC Chief Justice Correspondent Pete Williams, I cannot think of anyone better that I would want to have on. Thank you for explaining this all to us. I know it's a busy day.
Okay.
Thank you, Pete. The two California couples challenging Prop 8 talked about the fight that led them all the way to the Supreme Court today.
I believe in love. And Proposition 8 is a discriminatory law that hurts people. It hurts gays and lesbians in California, and it hurts the children we're raising, and it does so for no good reason.
From the beginning, this case has been about securing the right to marry the person that I love, and also having the equal access to the most important relationship that I know in life, and that's marriage.
And then there were the two high-profile lawyers, David Boies on your left and Ted Olson on your right, who were foes in the 2000 presidential recount race that are now allies in the fight for same-sex marriage.
Those of you who were in court today saw why I like it a lot better when this guy is on my side as opposed to against me.
If you, like me, followed that amazing debate, that's a crazy image. David Boies and Ted Olson. Chad Griffin is the president of the Human Rights Campaign and started the original appeal of Proposition 8 that made its way all the way to the court today. Chad, thanks for joining us. Let's talk about this.
Chris. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Pete talked about that there was some level of expectation with some folks that this might be the gay marriage or the gay rights Roe versus Wade, and that he thinks, based on what he heard today, we're more likely to go for a narrow ruling, maybe overturning Prop 8 in California, but not broadly in the country. Is that enough for you?
Look, I will leave it up to pundits and reporters like Pete to be able to read into what these justices, the questions that they ask. At the end of the day, these justices ask tough and probing questions of both sides, and that's exactly what they're there to do. What I focus on is the incredible argument that Ted Olson made before those justices, and the case that he made, that by denying these couples the fundamental right to marry the one that they love, it harms them gravely. And by the way, it also harms no one else by granting them that right. And as I said in that courtroom, looking at those 9 justices and listening to Ted Olson articulate that argument, all I could do was think about those 4 plaintiffs that were in that courtroom and their families and the thousands of Californians just like them and those around this country. And we always knew, Chris, that this court has many options here. This court has many options, and one would be the direction that Pete articulated, and another would be the case that we've made, in that there is a fundamental constitutional right to marriage. It's something guaranteed to all Americans. And so all we can do now is wait, and wait on these 9 justices to render their opinion.
I want to ask you to do a brief retelling, but the story of how you worked to get Prop 8 with these plaintiffs, to get Prop 8 to the Supreme Court. Quickly retell that. It's a fascinating backstory.
Sure. But more than 4 years ago, when President Obama was elected in that historic election, something terrible happened, in that in California, the hateful Proposition 8 was passed by a slim majority of those voters. And I and some colleagues of mine, Rob and Michelle Reiner and Christina Shockey, heard someone mentioned that Ted Olson might in fact share our view on marriage. I have to admit, Chris, I was initially doubtful, but I began a series of conversations with Ted and ultimately discovered that he believed in it personally, and he believed in it as a fundamental constitutional right. And we filed that case with these 4 plaintiffs nearly 4 years ago, and we won at federal district court. We won at the Court of Appeals, and I'm optimistic of what will ultimately happen here. But I can tell you this, Chris. By bringing Ted Olson and David Boies together, 2 lawyers that were on the opposite sides of Bush v. Gore, it allowed us for the first time to lift the partisan veil that we've always discussed the issue of marriage equality, and finally shine the spotlight on the human faces of suffering, those gay and lesbian families, those couples and their children who suffer day in and day out because they don't have the same right as their neighbors or their colleagues at work or their friends at church.